Now, the smartest guy with a bow tie in Chattanooga, Tennessee, David Toulis.
We argue here on David Toulis, 92.7 and 95.3 HD4 Nuclear Radio for local economy and the free market. And we are recently fueled. I've taken on new fuel and have much to think about and much to work on and to encourage you by here on the program, on the show. David Toulis, love your neighbor and buy local. Near is better than far, small than big, simple than complex. And in the footnotes at 5-point type, Helvetica font, of course, Helvetica being the neutral font, the font that does not have blades on the letters, but blade-free words, non-coercive, non-compulsory, non-police words. We have in the footnotes, personal is better than corporate, and physical is better than abstract. Brought to you by the website for the people who matter, and that's a small group of people indeed, Nuganomics.com. I have with me on the phone Michael Rhodes, who's an author, with a colleague. He is at Memphis Center for Urban Theological Studies for many years at Advanced Memphis, which is a free market Christian-oriented think tank that's helping the poor and the down and out and the formerly oppressed and oppressed people of that city make a gain through the marketplace, through service to others. Also, we have here in the studio Robby Holt, who is a co-author. He is the minister at North Shore Fellowship. The book is called Practicing the King's Economy, and it is a local economy volume that I want to recommend to you. And we have both writers here. Robby and Michael, what does practicing the King's economy mean, and how can the ideals that are espoused here based in Scripture, how do they really help other people? How do they work? So what in a nutshell is the main argument, Michael, and what are examples that show that you're not just talking just Christian chat? How do these ideas really work, Michael?
Yes. Thanks, David. It's a great question. So, as we said in the previous segment, I mean, a big part of the main idea for us is that we think what God is doing is laying out a potluck table where His people bring their gifts and give and receive those gifts in community, and that's a table where everybody, from our perspective, everyone who acknowledges Jesus as King has a place, and everyone, regardless of their economic or social station, regardless of what the world says about people's where they are on a hierarchy in the Christian community, and specifically gathered around the Lord's Supper table, the Eucharist table that we Christians celebrate. Everyone is welcomed as a full participant who gives and receives gifts in a community and at a table at which Jesus presides. And that means that in our economic lives, a lot of what we ought to be doing is bending the way we spend, save, invest, hire, compensate, etc., towards empowering our disadvantaged neighbors to bring their best social and economic gifts to the community through their own economic efforts.
Hey, Michael.
And,
Go ahead. Sorry. Well, I have a question. Can you give us an example where this has actually worked with someone in Memphis who was serially poor and had lots of the cards stacked against him?
Yeah, that's a great example. So one of the best stories, in my opinion, of how this plays out is my really good friend Donald Jenkins, who's over here in Memphis. And Donald grew up in the neighborhood where I live and that Advanced Memphis serves. It's a very, very disadvantaged community, economically speaking. And Donald has a really rough story. He was homeless. He was addicted to drugs. He was a drug dealer, incarcerated numerous times. But a really heroic pastor who lives around the corner from me, whose church is around the corner from me, told Donald about Jesus and invited Donald to this table where we can experience Jesus and experience forgiveness from sin and inclusion in God's people. And Donald came to Jesus and he experienced forgiveness, and he gave up the drugs and the illegal activity, and he married his girlfriend, and he started telling other people about Jesus, but he still needed a job. And so this organization that I worked for, Advanced Memphis, which is a Christian organization, was running this work-life program, which is a Christian job training ministry produced in partnership with the Chalmers Center right there at Covenant College in Chattanooga. It's consistent with When Helping Hurts and all of that. And Donald went through that work-life program and was ready to go to work. And so Advance had gone to other believers and said, could you use your influence in your business to open up opportunities for this guy who's got multiple felony records on his background? And because Christians bent their influence at their jobs towards inclusion, Advance was able to help Donald get his first job, get his next job, get a promotion, and eventually even hire them back on their own team where he now mentors other folks. But along the way, Donald said, you know what? I want to give an even bigger economic plate to the potluck. I want to start my own business. And specifically, I want to start my own lawn care business so I can hire other people like me in my neighborhood who think their only economic option is drugs. And so because Advance Memphis partnered with Launch Chattanooga right there in your community, Donald was able to go through an entrepreneurship training program. And then again, he was ready to go, and Advance Memphis called on members of the body of Christ and said, hey, can we find people to help mentor and encourage Donald? Can we have people willing to invest in Donald? Can we have people willing to give Donald his first opportunities at contracts? And people showed up and did those things.
Michael.
And because of that, Donald's been able to start this lawn care business that adds a bunch of money to his personal family income, but also allows him to hire others from our neighborhood.
You got to tell
a great place to the community.
What's another story?
You got to tell the story about when Donald was pitching to get the entrepreneurship gift, and his wife helped him.
When he was pitching his business at the end of the launch class, he kind of got to the end, and his wife, who was in the room, wasn't satisfied. She's like, Donald, tell him about the job. And Donald kind of turned into a little preacher, and he said, hey, I'm doing this business so that I can hire 100 people from my community who don't think they've got anything they can do besides sell drugs. And so Donald, the entrepreneurship, the job, it's not just allowing him to do better, right? It's not just allowing him to be better off. It's allowing him a better plate to the community, a better gift to the community by welcoming others into his economic life. So he's practicing the king's economy because others in the faith community practice the king's economy in relation to him. And that's a great example of this giving and receiving gifts in community that we're talking about.
That's part of what we love about the king's economy, though we don't think we have it all sewn up. We're trying to perceive it and practice it ourselves, is that it works in the places that you think nothing else can work. So one example is one of the poorest groups of people in India over 100 years ago, the Mizo people. They were Christians and they wanted to support pastors and missionaries, and they had literally almost nothing, but they were cooking 2 handfuls of rice a day. So what they decided to do was to eat a handful of rice a day, and every time they cooked, they took a handful of rice, threw it in the corner of what we would call a kitchen, but hardly like our kitchens. And so they threw a handful of rice, and they the whole community saved a handful of rice daily for a whole year. And after a whole year, that added up to $1.50. 100 years later, that same group of Christians in India, they raised $1.5 million a year through this practice called Bufatam, of literally just setting aside a handful of rice a day. As they've seen more and more people come to faith, they've got more people doing this practice. But that tiny little practice of the poor has created a whole lot of wealth for good causes.
Yeah, and something I want to say about that is, oftentimes when we think about charity, we're trying to build people up to be independent. But we think that what the Bible says and what's actually required is that we are welcoming people into a community that is interdependent.
Mutually.
And in my own life, as a person from a fairly wealthy background, it's not just that I've tried to help people like Donald give better plates at the potluck. I have been the recipient of Donald's good gifts and been challenged by Donald's example. And my relationship with Donald and men and women like him has taught me all sorts of things about the obstacles facing folks like Donald. I've learned about the racist housing policy that created the community that I lived in, and the failure of banks through redlining and predatory lending in my neighborhood that eviscerated black wealth throughout all the 20th century. And I've seen Donald, who's a harder worker than anybody I know, who's sold out for Jesus and who's serving his neighbor, demonstrate that God can help people overcome even those sorts of obstacles to bring their gifts to the community. And so it's just been inspiring to me, just being at the beginning stages of trying to experience the king's economy, of seeing what a gift this way of life is for everybody. This is a better way to live, where
This is David Toulis, and we're talking with We're talking with Michael Rhodes there. I was just interrupting him, and also about Robby Holt. They are the authors of a brand new book called Practicing the King's Economy. And if you're watching us live on YouTube or Facebook, you can see me holding my copy up. It's getting a bit tattered as I'm more than halfway through. We are live on YouTube. If you have a late model TV, there is a YouTube channel. And think of the benefit of having the David Tulis Show or the Marie Mott Show live in your living room on your TV through YouTube. And that's Nougat Radio, live on Facebook, of course. And we are trying to find out how the Christian ideals work in practice, because the Christianity brings freedom and the free market. Christianity is all about freedom, liberty. And when men reject God, they inevitably create systems which are not free and which create subservience and a hierarchical society, the haves and the have-nots, the people with power at the top and those at the bottom often not having much opportunity. And Robby Holt has something to say about that. Go ahead, well, Robby.
I'm going to send David something later today, and I sent it to Michael 2 days ago, but there's a historian named Tom Holland in the UK, and he grew up. He's a classic scholar, and he studied the Greco-Roman world. He studied Greek empires, Roman empires, and he was fascinated by these things. And he's written on the history of Greece and Rome, and then also medieval European history. And he actually has come to a conclusion recently, that's much like what you just said, David, is that our present Western world takes for granted the rights of people, the dignity of people, the rights of certain rights that we ought to give one another, even in international justice. And basically, this is fascinating because this guy has not converted to Christianity, but you can watch an interview with him. It's an hour long where he's discussing these things with a New Testament scholar named N.T. Wright. And what Tom Holland, the classic scholar, says is that a lot of the rights and goods and privileges we take for granted in our culture today do not actually come from directly Greece or Rome or even the Enlightenment on its own terms, but he argues they come from the Christian faith, from the scriptures, from the Jewish Old Testament and the scriptures as a whole. And he even in this interview says they come from the four Gospels and Paul's letters that Paul dropped depth charges in places like Corinth and Rome that reshaped the West. And you can see it, these long-term ripple effects where people actually begin to treat each other with great dignity, not just in first century Rome where men had all kinds of rights that a lot of those we would say are immoral. People with power and privilege began to think about what was good for their neighbor and their communities. And it actually changed how we view the relationship between individuals and law, et cetera.
Well, what Christianity does, Robby Holt, is bring horizontality into culture and society. When we have a rejection of Christianity, which is what we've had in the past 150 years in the United States, we have verticalization of society and culture where you have the great ones at the top and you have a kind of a pyramid, and the common men like my listener and I, we're at the bottom. We always have to bow and scrape to them. All these rules and laws that are written are on how we're supposed to treat the people who are better than we are, and how we're to obey all their commandments and stipulations and rules and paperwork. Christianity, though, brings freedom and liberty, which brings less verticality and more horizontality, which means more dealings in society among equals. So that means there's occasion for my listener to look to help the poor people, not through lobbying Congress for another bill or for more money for food stamps, but there's a responsibility that he has that can make a poor person have an opportunity that is more possible. The gospel encourages looking out for neighbors, looking left and right as opposed to up and down. Robby,
it's interesting that Michael a little while ago talked about the Lord's Supper or communion or Eucharist, and sometimes even in my own tradition, we reduce the Lord's table to a place where we sort of celebrate individual forgiveness. And as a pastor, I never want to leave that part behind. But the original Passover meal and the Lord's Supper that takes its place in the Christian faith is a meal about liberty, where people are set free from false kingdoms and false powers to live together as God's people together in a new corporate way that sees one another as family. But it's not utterly exclusive, because not only do we see each other as family and deeply care for each other in this way that Michael described earlier as this mutually interdependent lives, but we're the very people called to like love our neighbors as ourselves. We're told to do good to those who persecute us. And so we're a community that's living by the grace of God, living by the gifts of God, living in mutual interdependence, but also we're called to sacrifice for the common good of our neighbors who don't acknowledge the God that we serve.
Yeah, and as a point of clarity from, I think, the perspective of our book, David, we do not prescribe a lot of political sort of like vote differently kind of recommendations, but that's not because we don't think that laws are important or that Christians shouldn't be involved with advocating for laws that create more opportunity for the poor. I often think of Deuteronomy 15, where you have this really strong legislation, every 7 years, you've got to declare the Sabbath year and forgive debts so people don't get enslaved to debt. So this is a really important law that God gives his people at that time to protect the poor. But then it basically acknowledges nobody will follow that law if people aren't becoming neighbors and brothers and sisters and family. In other words, if we don't have a transformed heart, those laws are going to prove ineffective. So I think the Bible makes clear we need just legal structures, but we also need people who are being transformed to wisely figure out what those structures are and to live within them. So for this book, what we're trying to say is, here's how we begin to practice these things in our own life, experience transformation through God's power and through the tools that he's given us. And then we can begin to figure out what is required for us as a community to embrace this kind of potluck.
Let me ask you a question, Michael. One of my suggestions for my listener on the David Tullis Show here at Nooga Radio is to divest nationally and invest locally. I think we are facing a major disaster in the equities markets in the global financial capitals. And so my listener, I suggest bring his money here. Okay, so he's got his mutual funds and his stocks sold, and he's got $500,000 in the bank, in 2 or 3 banks, since he wants to keep the FDIC protections. How could he invest locally? I mean, is it practical to even talk about that, since there are no real mechanisms in Chattanooga for loco-centric investing with a kind of a Christian other oriented perspective? How can that be done? What do you suggest?
Yeah, I think there are a number of opportunities. I do think that impact investing, which is what I would kind of frame what you're talking about as, is an emerging field, and structures are developing, and we give a lot of resources on our book. And you can even look at the resources page on our book webpage, practicingthekingseconomy.org, and find some resources around impact investing. But there are some things that are already starting. One is, Robby mentioned kiva.org. That's for zero interest loans. And they're only up to $10,000. There's a limit to how much of you can do that, but you directly choose who you're lending to. And Launch Chattanooga will.
Can you say that again?
Kiva.org, KIVA.org. You can make zero interest loans, and you choose the borrower. And so you can choose people who are local to you. Launch Chattanooga sometimes has people up on there.
New local businesses you can invest in.
There is also it's not immediately local, but there is an organization called Calvert Capital, CALVERT Capital, that offers what's called a community note. So it's a fixed interest note. They've been around for more than 20 years. They've always repaid principal and interest. But all of the money that you invest through that community note is going to things like affordable housing, minority-owned businesses, financial intermediaries that work in low-income communities, et cetera. And then there's also the possibility of, if you're partnering with an organization like Launch, of angel investing with people, of directly working with businesses that are being started by people who don't have access, or by businesses that are uniquely trying to solve social problems. So right here in our city, we have a bunch of what I would call social entrepreneurs, like my friends who started Lucy J's Bakery. They're great bakers. They've always wanted to start a bakery, but the wife also worked for a home that welcomes homeless families to live together. And so they started Lucy J's Bakery, which hires people currently experiencing homelessness to create really great baked goods. And those folks have...
Michael, let me just interrupt you. We have just a minute left. Robby, you wanted to get something in. Thank you, though.
Well, I think what Michael and I, and even you said a minute ago, David, about where to invest, investing here, investing there, will sound like crazy talk to some people. And here's a place where I'd make an argument for the view of the world that Christians can hold. We've been told in our culture that economics is a zero-sum game. There are very limited resources. We live in a scarcity mindset. But what Christians believe is that this is God's world. God is infinitely generous. It's a real world that we have to account for wisely, but we belong to God. He's committed to his purposes and his people, his purposes for the whole creation and all the peoples of the earth. And so there's reasons that we have to invest in ways that maybe might make sense to us.
This is David Toulis. Robby, Holt, thanks for joining us. And Michael Rhodes, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it very much.
Thanks, David. Yeah, it's great to be with you.
This is David Toulis, and we have some important messages. The book is Practicing the King's Economy. I recommend you get it. It's a terrific read. I'm in the middle of it now. Practicing the King's Economy with Robby Holt and Michael Rhodes. David Toulis, thank you.
3, 2, 1. Chattanooga Radio. Digital FM 95.3 HD4. 92.7 FM's news now.
2 men fell off the edge of a Suck Creek Mountain trail. One of them later died at the hospital, according to the Marion County Sheriff. Rescuers recovered the 2 men Saturday afternoon, both victims reportedly in their 20s. Grundy County deputies pull over William Dunwoody on Friday night for driving on a suspended license. The reports say the 62-year-old's car was searched after deputies say they got consent. Inside, deputies report they discovered 14 grams of methamphetamine. Dunwoody taken to jail and a female passenger arrested on unrelated warrants.